Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Digital Budget Town Hall. We'll start here at 6 o'clock. If you want to go ahead and start asking questions on our Facebook page, YouTube page, we will be monitoring both of those platforms and answering those at the end, but we'll get things going at 6 o'clock. Hey, Steve, it doesn't look like we're up on YouTube yet. Can you double check that one? Thank you, Steve. Sorry about that. All right, everyone, it is 6 o'clock, so we'll get things going here for the Digital Budget Town Hall. We will have a brief presentation from City Manager Zach Walker, who will walk us through the proposed budget as it was presented to the City Council on Monday. There is an official budget public hearing on Monday as well. So this is an opportunity for the public to ask questions in this town hall. We will be taking questions on Facebook Live and YouTube Live throughout this event. So if you're watching on the different platforms, you can type those into the screens there as the city manager is presenting, and we'll take those at the end. If it is a question that is similar to others that have been asked, we will answer one of the questions from our different platforms. And then if there are questions that we are unable to get to during our time tonight, we will follow up with those. So at this time, we will transition things over to City Manager Zach Walker, who will walk us through the proposed budget.
Okay, thank you, Meg, and thank you all of you who are joining us this evening. As Meg Lewis said, my name is Zach Walker. I'm the City Manager for the City of Independence. As has been our practice the last several years, following our formal submittal of our proposed budget to the City Council, we've had a budget town hall for our public to become more familiar with the proposed budget in advance of that public comment period. Unfortunately, with the public health restrictions that are still in place, we're not able to do this in person this year, but we really do believe this is important to help the community understand what is in the budget and have that opportunity to become familiar so that they can be a part of that conversation prior to the adoption of the budget. Just a little bit about process before we get deep into the details tonight. Our city charter, which is our governing document, requires annually that we present a budget to the City Council about 45 days prior to it being adopted by the Council. That budget is also required to be balanced. Unlike the federal government, we can't run a deficit, so we have to make sure that whatever our revenues or the money we're bringing into the city is equal to and balances out with the expenditures that we make. A budget is not a financial statement, it is a plan. It is a statement of priorities about where we as an organization see ourselves going, the types of services we see ourselves providing over the course of the next year, but we also have to be flexible as the year unfolds as well. So in accordance with our city charter, it was my pleasure Monday night to present that proposed budget to the City Council. It's my pleasure tonight to share that with you as our public. So we will go ahead and get into the details. As has been the case the last several years, our guiding document is our strategic plan, Independence for All. This was a document adopted by the City Council back in February of 2017. This document was adopted based on community feedback from our citizen satisfaction survey, from discussions that our elected officials and our city staff were having with members of the community. So a lot of representation went into this document and really helped us understand what our core goals were. And then our city staff worked to identify the strategies of how we would achieve those goals. 3 years into this plan now, we're right on track. We've adopted and implemented 60% of those identified strategies. A number of successes up and down the board associated with this, and that's something we're quite proud of. We laid out a vision, and we're really making excellent strides towards making this document a success. Heading into this budget year, this one is starting to look a little different than prior budget years, but in a better way. The past several years, as me and my leadership team sat down to develop a proposed budget, we were facing budgetary shortfalls that would range anywhere from $2 to $4 million. One of the key objectives of Independence for All is long-range financial sustainability. And our efforts the last several years had really put us on an upward trajectory towards that. We certainly weren't in a place where we were flush with cash and able to add a whole bunch of new services, but those large budgetary shortfalls were not showing up this year. And that was allowing us to have some important, meaningful conversations about, while we certainly knew we couldn't do everything, what were some of those key priorities that we might begin to weave back into or add into the budget. What you see on this screen are some of those key things, whether that be reinstating some of the funding for code enforcement that had been previously reduced, whether that was beginning to develop a citywide housing study to address issues of blight and home ownership in our community, whether that was adding to our ability to better maintain our city assets like our streets and our bridges and our sidewalks and our parks and our historic sites. These were some of the conversations that we were finally able to have because of those important conversations that we've had the last several years. But then in March, disaster really began to strike not only just our community, but across this country, and disaster coming in the form of the COVID-19 pandemic. On March 12th, in response to a very widening public health crisis, Mayor Weir declared a state of emergency for the city of Independence. As this chart shows you, in the days that followed, the city began to deploy a strategy of containment aimed at slowing the spread of the virus so that we didn't overwhelm our health systems. Shortly thereafter, on March 22nd, Jackson County issued a stay-at-home order, which really put a lockdown, particularly on our business community, as residents were asked to self-isolate at home, and restrictions were placed on business operations. We really began to see a stalemate and a stalling of our local economy. And that's really the position that we've been in for about the last 60 days now. Some important milestones along the way that we'll talk about as well tonight, but in early April, our city council did approve a $25 million interfund loan in the event that we need to draw down that on an emergency basis. In mid-April, that stay-at-home order was extended, but as of this past Monday at 12:01 a.m., that stay-at-home order has now expired. We have not just fully, of course, resumed business as usual, but businesses are slowly beginning to reopen under the Jackson County Phase 1 reopening plan. Like I mentioned, certainly those containment strategies were important to help us slow the spread of the virus. to minimize the surge that would have otherwise likely hit our medical community, our hospitals. And those were important, meaningful measures that have been and continue to be taken. But you can't restrict business and you can't restrict public mobility without having an economic impact. And those numbers have been and continue to be staggering. There are many different indicators that we could share. A couple of key highlights I'll share with you tonight. The United States gross domestic product. That is a measure of economic activity. How many goods and services are being produced and at what rate are those being consumed by the public, by the consumer. That is expected to plunge by 40%. Unemployment in this country, this number is now dated. That's closer to $33 million. In February of this year, that unemployment rate was at 3.5%. That number is nearly 15% now. A number that I saw today that is just absolutely staggering. From 2010 until March of this year, there were 20 million jobs added in this country. In the month of April, that entire gain was wiped out as 20 million jobs were lost. I saw another statistic today that small businesses, which are certainly a backbone of this country and of this community, it is expected that nationwide in the next 2 months, 3.5 million small businesses will forever close. These are statistics and figures that have not been seen in this country since the Great Depression of the 1930s. And really to put that in context here locally, one of the bedrock revenue sources that we rely on to fund the basic services that we provide is our sales tax revenue. That comes, of course, from the purchases that are made at brick and mortar retail establishments in this community. Those numbers are expected to drop by at least 21%. It is really the common viewpoint of most economists that two of the areas that are most likely to suffer the most and have the longest recovery time are retail sales and tourism, which are, of course, two of the primary revenue sources that we as a community rely upon. So that is certainly devastating and shows the magnitude of the problem that we're dealing with. This chart puts into perspective and quantifies a little bit better what I mean when I say the devastating losses. Our fiscal year runs from July 1st of each year till June 30th of the following year. So when this pandemic began to unfold in March of this year, we really only had about 90 days of the fiscal year, the current fiscal year remaining. But even still, we are estimating in that remaining 90 days until June 30th, a loss citywide of $8.4 million just from our retail sales tax revenue, and an additional $3.4 million is being forecast as a loss in retail sales in next year's budget for a total pandemic loss right now of $11.8 million. Our approach to this right now has primarily been to forecast our most significant reductions in our sales tax revenue, but there are other key areas that we are monitoring, and the longer that this situation drags on, the more significant and dire those will probably become. I'm speaking of things like our business license permits, our building permits, our utility billing revenues, our municipal court fines. All these restrictions, all these things being closed, if they're not open, people can't make purchases, they can't make those investments, they can't pay for those things, and that is making it more and more likely that those areas will also see further revenue decline in the months ahead. So this goes ahead and shows with our general fund. Our general fund is our most diverse fund and funds most of the basic services that you would likely think of when you think of the city, things like police and fire, public works and parks, community development, neighborhood services, things of that nature. In the current fiscal year, again, the one that runs through June 30th of 2020, our fund balance, which is like our savings account, had a total balance of $6 million. Our city council has adopted a best practices policy that says we should have a fund balance reserve minimum of 16%. Instead, that number right now at the time was closer to 8%. So we were half of what our minimum amount should be. We've been trending upward in that, which is a positive, but we're certainly still below the minimum amount that we needed to be at. But the sales tax revenue loss from this pandemic for the general fund in the current fiscal year is estimated to be $4.6 million, which would have pulled our fund balance all the way down to $1.3 million, or 2%. That is a desperately low amount. Should a natural disaster or some other emergency situation unfold, we would be severely limited in our ability to cover our expenses with that minimum fund balance. So 2 strategies have been undertaken to try to mitigate that loss. We asked our departments in the last 90 days of the fiscal year to try to identify savings and cuts. Something close to 80% of our general fund budget is in personnel, and that makes it very difficult without cutting our staff and adversely impacting them to make those reductions. So our staff was able to identify about $500,000 in savings. And then of that $25 million loan that I identified previously that the City Council approved, we are planning to draw down $2 million of that in the current fiscal year to keep our fund balance at $3.8 million, or 5%. And again, trying to get back to that 16% balance. So then we really have to start thinking about, when does this begin to turn around, and developing a budget, how drastic do our reductions need to be? Identifying what that recovery is going to look like is really dependent on 2 primary factors. One of those is timing. When is the economy, the restrictions, those containment strategies, when are those lifted, and when are folks able to begin to mobilize around again? Right now, the Jackson County stay-at-home order, we are in phase 1 of that reopening. The county has not fully revealed that reopening plan, but generally speaking, what we understand that will look like long-term is about a 4-phase reopening with about 2 to 3 weeks built in between each of those phases. So in the best case of scenarios, we're looking at 8 to 12 weeks before those restrictions are fully lifted. That is assuming that there are no setbacks, surges in cases that would necessitate a movement backwards into those additional lockdowns, into those additional restrictions. That said, probably the most important factor, even more so than timing, is consumer confidence, because even if everything is open, even if businesses are fully prepared for consumers to return to their stores, it doesn't really matter if those consumers don't show back up. It's going to be critically important to understand where is the confidence level of the consumer. There is a group based out of New York called the Conference Board. One of the many things they measure is the Consumer Confidence Index. They've done that for many, many years. Consumer Confidence Index is a measure of just what it sounds like. How sure and how confident are consumers that they have plenty of disposable income to go out and spend money at the store, to go out and eat in restaurants, to make new purchases, etc. In March of this year, that index was sitting at about 118 points. By April, that number had dropped to 86 points, and indications are that that is now down into the 70s at this point. That is the largest 1-month drop that the consumer or the Conference Board has seen in the 53-year history that they have measured that. So right now, if you think about it, from March 12th, when the emergency order was placed, to today, not a lot has changed in terms of widespread testing, contact tracing, which is understanding people who are contagious, who have they come in contact with, and of course there is no widespread immunization or vaccine available yet. So I think many of these indexes are showing people are still anxious and nervous, absent some of those assurances that they won't become sick or ill if they begin to circulate out in public again. So understanding that uncertain viewpoint and still utilizing our Independence for All strategic plan, we went into this budget process with some key guiding principles in mind, really around some of these economic factors. Number one, we wanted to make strategic use of that interfund loan approved by City Council. That was certainly a bold leadership move by the City Council. But that said, if you liken the city to an individual, that loan is just like us going to the bank and getting a loan or putting a charge on our credit card. That money still must be repaid, and it must be repaid with interest. I think most of us expect individuals to try to do their best to live within their means and not overextend themselves with debt. And similarly, It is our recommendation that the city be responsible, that the city be wise steward of the public dollars and not overextend itself with debt. And therefore, we're trying to be very cautious and almost use that loan as an emergency situation. Number two, maintaining police and fire services. There is no arguing that those are among some of the more high dollar expenditures in our budget, but they are the men and women who are in large part on the front line of providing the response to this pandemic. And that said, is our belief those budgets need to be maintained to the extent possible. The long-term ramifications. I believe we all expect the virus to be temporary. Eventually there will be immunizations. Eventually there will be some safeguards put in place. But what are those long-term ramifications? Which businesses are forever closed as a result of this? What becomes the new norm? The changes in consumer behavior, things of that nature. So trying to get a handle on that and understanding what those new revenues will look like based on changes in citizen and consumer behavior. We also do look at this as an opportunity for innovation. This is certainly a crisis situation, but that is presenting us with the opportunity to do some self-reflection and where we can become more efficient and also improve our service delivery at the same time. We are trying to make targeted and strategic reductions. We did not go into this budget asking every department to just make an across-the-board reduction. Instead, we asked our department directors to look at all of their service delivery areas and help us understand using data, what do these programs cost, how are they utilized by our community, and in what ways are those costs managed, and how are those trending. So we're trying to certainly use data to inform our decision making and not just go at this blindly. As I mentioned, we're trying to continue to identify those cost saving measures. How do we get more lean? How do we get more efficient? So on and so forth. And that really leads into the last principle, which is financial sustainability. Our financial challenges existed prior to this pandemic. As I mentioned, we have been an organization that is highly reliant on retail sales tax. That has been the city's economic development strategy for many years. You think the Independence Center, the 39th Street corridor, the expansion of the service industries, like with restaurants and hotels, et cetera. And that served us well for many years. But the fact of the matter is consumer behavior is changing. More online sales are happening. People are ordering off of things like Uber Eats and having that food brought to their house, so on and so forth. So we want to make sure that we build that stability and understand that the virus did not cause this problem. It's only further accelerating the downward trends in some of these revenues that were already eroding anyway. So now we're going to talk about the budget itself. The budget for this year, citywide, totals $311 million. That is a 2% decrease over last year's proposed budget, or a total of $5.1 million. The biggest areas that have seen reduction are, of course, the general fund, our sales tax funds, those voter-approved sales tax funds, and our electric utility fund, the Independence Power and Light Fund. The City Council approved a 6% rate reduction over the last year, which then, of course, necessitated those operational reductions to meet those 6% rate reductions. Citywide, there were already budget pressures in place that are affecting all of our funds, regardless of the revenue source. Workers' compensation and risk management, these are programs and services that are in place, like our insurance for our employees who are injured or hurt on the job, as well as the insurance for our various city assets like our fleet, our facilities, etc. Just as if you were to use your homeowner's insurance or you were to use your medical health insurance or your auto insurance, the more frequently you use them, your premiums are likely to go up as you're identified as a high user. We are a high user of workers' comp and risk management. We are an organization of 1,000 employees, 78 square miles in the city. There are opportunities, and that's why these insurances are in place. But the more we use it, those go up, and those are affecting our costs as well. ERP, we as an organization had a legacy system for managing our finances and for managing our personnel records in our human resources department. Several years ago, our city council voted to authorize us to upgrade those. The ongoing implementation costs and then maintenance costs associated with those, $1.4 million across several city funds there. Our loggers is our city employee retirement system. That's a statewide program that we participate in for the pension system for our retirees. Those costs are going up 1% across the board, which means for our general municipal employees, about 19% of payroll, closer to 20% for fire and police, respectively. Of course, I mentioned the flat sales tax growth that was occurring even before the pandemic as the shift to online sales continues. And then, of course, we're projecting a $3.4 million loss citywide due to the pandemic and due to the dramatic loss in the sales tax revenue. I want to talk about the general fund specifically now. The general fund budget for this year is proposed to be about $72.8 million. That is a pretty substantial decrease for us this year, and this can be mostly attributed again to the revenue fallout from the pandemic. Just a high-level overview of what that looks like. Those budget pressures in the general fund or losses, we're looking to be close to $2.8 million. We went into this with our leadership team then identifying cuts that total $4.3 million. That gives us a contingency or a cushion of about $1.5 million. If you remember at the beginning of this presentation, I told you a budget is a plan. Oftentimes, that plan deviates. Different factors that were unforeseen or unknown at the time the budget was proposed come into play. Right now, as I showed you, we are anticipating a fall recovery for this pandemic, but every single day we see more and more factors, reports, forecasts that seem to indicate that that may be more and more of an optimistic picture. So if that is the case, if our fall timeline of a recovery is not adequate, then this budget has built into it a $1.5 million contingency to guard against those further losses. If the economy is just back up and humming and all is well again by the fall, that $1.5 million can be added to our savings account or our fund balance and would bring us back up to a fund balance of 8% again, where we were at prior to the pandemic, and again halfway to our minimum balance for the general fund. With this slide, I wanted to illustrate for you, this is the previous slide I showed the various issues that we were debating pre-pandemic. One of the very first budgetary reductions we made once the pandemic began to unfold was to wipe out all of those new cost increases that we were contemplating, with one key exception. A known expense that we have annually in our budget is overtime costs for our public safety officials, our public safety personnel, I should say, as well as our minimum staffing, which is overtime costs in our fire department. Those are costs that have been known to us, that are historically a part of our budget, that are obligated costs for us. It does not seem like bad guys do their crimes between 8 and 5 Monday through Friday, nor do fire and medical calls come in between 8 and 5 Monday through Friday. So we have to have overtime costs to help cover those things. This budget has those costs now adequately funded to meet those historic amounts that we've seen the last several years. I'll continue to work with our police and fire chief to manage those expenses wisely, but we do know that those are costs we're going to incur, and therefore it's our responsibility to budget adequately for those. Now we're taking a look at the general fund budget reduction summary sorted by department. Again, you can tell that number is $4.3 million, but a better representation of this is over here, where we look at this a little bit more topically. The large orange area is mostly reflective of those new cost increases that we had built in for the risk management insurance, the workers' compensation insurance, and the across-the-board increases or salary increases for our general fund employees. We were going to budget that at about 1% across-the-board salary increase this year. Our philosophy is that we want to try to preserve our workforce as much as we can. So we're foregoing those wage increases this year, but doing so in an effort to, again, try to preserve jobs to the best of our ability. That said, we're not going to escape this unscathed. This budget has a reduction of 12 full-time employees and 2 vacant positions. So for a total of 14 positions, which represents about 16% of our savings. You may see other public organizations, local governments, or even private sector organizations that are doing furloughs. We are not doing furloughs in this budget simply because furloughs are a one-time stopgap measure, and we are looking for permanent cost-saving reductions to budget for what we believe is a new normal and to match our true budgetary picture. We have cost allocation savings in here. What that means is charging the salary and benefit expenses for our employees to grants and sales tax funds where we are authorized and allowed to do so. The upside of that is, again, we're giving ourselves general fund budgetary relief. We're preserving jobs. The downside of that is those are less dollars that are available for the actual program delivery themselves. So we have the certainly the employees to do the work, but not necessarily then all of the full effect that we'd rather have with those. One of the things proposed in this budget and was previously announced is a reorganization of our public works, water pollution control, and community development departments. Public works and water pollution control were previously one single department back in the 1980s, at which time they were split out into 2 departments. This budget is going to see the reunification of those 2 departments back into one. The engineering services are going to be transferred down to our community development department, where we already have our plan review and our building permitting functions. So a lot of the feedback we have heard from the development community, folks trying to open a new restaurant or a new small business, something like that, is that process coming into City Hall can often seem disjointed or unpredictable. We know this doesn't solve everything, but putting that down there into one department, to our belief, will help make that more user-friendly, more streamlined, and a more consistent customer service outcome. Finally, this budget does contemplate some significant reductions in our transit system, and I'm going to transition to this slide to speak a little bit about that. In this city right now, we fund 3 different types of transit services. We fund a paratransit service, which services an elderly and disabled population. This budget anticipates keeping that exactly as it is right now. We also fund an intercity service, which are routes between Independence and Kansas City, Missouri, several times a day. Again, this budget proposes preserving that exactly as it is right now. The reduction that's being proposed is to our fixed route system, which is probably more commonly known as our IndyBus system. A few slides ago, I spoke to you and said that we were using data to try to drive our reductions to make those targeted and strategic. A couple things that are showing up here on this chart. Our costs over the last 3 years have increased. Those costs have increased about 9% over the last 3 years. Our revenues are decreasing. Those revenues have decreased about 2.5% over the last 3 years. While certain routes have very strong ridership, as a whole, the fixed route system is seeing a decrease in total ridership. FTA funding is Federal Transportation Authority. That is funding that we get from the Kansas City Area Transportation Authority, or KCATA. That has increased, but has increased marginally over the last 3 years. All said, the general fund subsidy for this, or covering that difference between what it costs to operate it and what we're bringing in, has increased 15.5% over the last 3 years. That 15.5% means then that that's come from other services like Public Works, like our Parks Department. It's meant we can't add additional services to our police or fire department in order to keep up with the cost increases over here. It is therefore the proposal to eliminate that fixed route system. That would be about an $825,000 savings in this year's budget, because that would be effective August 1st, $900,000 annually thereafter. All that said, our city council and our city staff see transit as a very vital and important service, and we are working aggressively to find solutions to avoid making this reduction permanently, or at all, I should say. We are in close contact with the Kansas City Area Transportation Authority, KCATA, and really trying to drive at two things. One, help find long-term financially sustainable funding to help support this system, to help manage those costs and have adequate revenue to provide that service. And number two, to really identify who are those riders in our community, where are they at, where are they trying to get to, and really design a system that meets those needs so that we don't have empty buses driving around. We don't have these routes that have the declining system. And that really is an important responsibility of the Regional Transit Authority. And we're in very close contact with them, having communications multiple times a day, working very aggressively on this. Our city council has a transit oversight committee that met today for about 2 hours discussing this, working very diligently, as I said, to try to find a solution here. So moving on, I want to talk about some of the other highlights in the budget. The Health and Recreation Levy. This is a property tax assessment that was approved by the voters of independence decades ago. That levy brings in about $2.6 million annually and is to be used for exactly what it indicates, health and recreation activities. That has traditionally been booked as a general fund revenue. We want to have greater transparency and greater oversight of those funds to ensure that they're being spent in exactly the manner that the voters approved. So it's our proposal to council in this budget to establish a standalone health and recreation fund. It's our proposal then to keep those funds going for most of the same uses that they have. So for the health portion of that, it's our proposal to fund the Animal Services Division to the tune of $832,000, and then the balance going to Parks and Recreation for $1.8 million. The net effect here would be then that both Animal Services and Parks and Recreation would be fully out of the general fund at this point, living off of the recreational levy and their other revenue sources. As I mentioned, we have several voter-approved sales tax funds. Those sales taxes are wholly reliant on retail sales at brick and mortar stores. And as I said earlier, we're forecasting a 21% decline there. So given that that is their sole revenue source, we're working to mitigate those losses in a number of ways. For the police sales tax fund, that means a decrease in the uniform, equipment, and vehicle budgets. For the fire sales tax fund, where they were proposing to outright purchase an aerial apparatus, another word for a fire truck. They're instead going to lease that now, which will spread those payments out over a longer period of time. In the park sales tax fund, we previously announced we weren't opening the Adventure Oasis Water Park for this season. Again, it wasn't looking likely that we would be able to have that open by Memorial Day with the health restrictions in place. And that is such a short season already that the longer that remained closed, the more likely that that would be a significant budgetary loss to the city. So the decision was made to go ahead and announce early on that we wouldn't be opening that this year. Additionally, the park sales tax will be delaying a number of important capital projects like playground equipment upgrades, improvements to the various rec sites that will be deferred to a later date. In the street sales tax fund, they are planning to reduce capital project funding by $3.8 million, likely see a smaller annual street overlay program this year. They'll also be reducing their operating budget out of that fund and having to delay purchase of necessary equipment as a result. In the stormwater sales tax fund, again, delaying important capital projects that had been put into our 5-year plan, and then decreasing our emergency repairs budget, or fix-it budget, if you will. That will be a smaller pot of money this year to make those. And finally, our transient guest tax, which is our tax on lodging establishments, hotels, and motels. That area, again, has seen a severe decline, whereas they normally have about 80% occupancy at this time of year. That's more down in the 20 to 30% range now. So as a result of those losses, delaying capital projects for things like the National Frontier Trails Museum, the Pioneer Spring Cabin, the Vale Mansion, the Bingham Wagner Estate, some of those really key historic assets in our community. This is the first fiscal year that will see inclusion of the voter-approved use tax. This is more commonly known as Proposition P, which was approved by the voters last November. That is a tax on online sales from businesses that have a physical location in Missouri. We anticipate in this budget revenue of $1.5 million. I will tell you in reviewing our sales tax, most recent sales tax report, this is the only sales tax that is seeing substantial growth. January, which was the first month of collection, had $90,000. The March report was $290,000, so that's increased threefold. We expect those April numbers to be substantially higher as people have been at home and doing most of their shopping online. That voter-approved sales tax is to be used for two earmarked activities in accordance with the voter approval. One of those is $750,000 annually for the animal shelter, which in this year's budget will allow for the funding of over 15 full-time employees and then the necessary supplies to run the shelter. The other part of that tax is to be used to hire up to 30 new police officers and their associated equipment needs. So this will, in this proposed budget, allow for the hiring 4 police officers, 2 sergeants, and their vehicles and supplies. Let's talk quickly about our utility funds. Power and Light, the electric utility fund, a budget there about $142 million, which is a decrease of $1.8 million over last year. The full-time employee count there has dropped by 29 from last year to a total of 176 in the current proposed budget. That is driven by the approval to close the Blue Valley Power Plant effective June the 1st, as well as the elimination of some other vacant positions at the electric utility. This also does account for the 6% rate reduction, as we've mentioned, approved by the City Council. And pleased to report that this budget also does meet the savings balance, the fund balance requirement, which is a 90-day reserve requirement. Our water fund budget of $33.4 million, which is a reduction of about $160,000. No change in the total number of employees there. That remains at 94.9. A capital budget this year of $4.2 million. A big portion of that is again dedicated to a main replacement program. So upgrading the water mains in the city to avoid the main breaks and the associated outages there. We are also reinstituting our 15-year meter replacement program. This time last year, there was significant council discussion around moving towards an automated meter reading program, also known as AMI. That was deferred for a year and doesn't seem like that has a lot of momentum at this time. So knowing that we need to replace those meters so that we get accurate reads for our customers, we are moving back towards a 15-year meter replacement program. Finally, with water pollution control, again, we are merging this with our Public Works Department into the new Municipal Services Department. That in and of itself will save about $33,000 in the sewer fund and $86,000 in the stormwater sales tax fund. This has a reduction overall of 5.5 employees from last year for a total count now of 77 full-time employees. And wanted to highlight for all of you, one of the major expenses that they'll see this year is the acquisition of a new TV truck. That is an asset that allows us to inspect the sanitary sewer lines, the stormwater lines, make sure that those are in good working condition and we can make necessary repairs before failure would become catastrophic. Then wrapping up tonight, these are items that I have noted that I believe to be important for the City Council, our city staff and city employees to be discussing in the year ahead. These aren't items that are specifically proposed for funding or modification in the budget, but they are items that, in association with my fiduciary responsibility to keep the council informed of our finances, I believe need to be addressed in the not so distant future. Those include making important upgrades to our city technology, especially with regard to our cybersecurity. We as a city are entrusted with a tremendous amount of personal data, like our one of the big areas being our customer information for utility billing. Unfortunately, it has become more common practice for cyber terrorists to hack local government organizations and hold that information ransom and compromise that data. So we need to make the necessary upgrades to continue to try to stay ahead of the curve there. Some of the personnel items that we believe need to be continuously reviewed and discussed, particularly in the year ahead. One of those revolves around our accrued leave payouts. Right now, our city employees, when they hire on, are afforded the ability to earn up to 1,040 hours of sick leave, 400 hours of vacation leave, and 60 hours of personal business leave. And at the time they separate from the city, they are paid out their balance for those hours up to those total amounts I just listed at their current hourly rate. In the last 18 months, our employees, not counting the ones who have maybe left to take another job or moved on, but who have retired from service for the city, that total liability has cost $2.5 million. So we want to have a conversation with our workforce and with our council about, is that still our preferred way of doing business, or do we want to look to modify that down the road? Health insurance, there are no changes proposed to health insurance in this budget, but we have a good city employee committee that's known as our Stay Well Advisory Committee that we have a great deal of confidence in. We want to work with that committee over the next year to continue to manage the ever-increasing costs in our health insurance program, particularly with regard to wellness. Unfortunately, a great many of our insurance plan members have a chronic disease or illness, which requires ongoing consultation with medical professionals and or use of medication to treat those chronic illnesses. That does come at a cost, as we are a self-insured program and pay 80% of those costs. Ultimately, that means taxpayer dollars going to support that. So we want to keep those costs from increasing. It's not realistic to think health insurance costs won't go up, but the more we can manage our health and keep those expenses down, then that leaves dollars available to provide basic city services. Finally, we know of a couple of key areas that more than likely are going to have long-term ramifications as a result of this pandemic. Pension contributions, again, I mentioned our loggers retirement system for our city retirees. A large part of that is dependent on investment in the stock market. If you follow that, there's been a great deal of volatility over the last several months in the stock market, and early signs are that there'll need to be some additional contributions made to help make up for losses in pension funding. Our health insurance premiums, again, those go up just naturally anyway, but again, widely believe that with the significant strain on the healthcare industry as a result of the pandemic, that there will be across-the-board increases for government, public, private sector insurance entities in the year and years ahead. And lastly, economic incentive debt. We do have a number of projects in the city, economic development projects that are reliant upon sales tax revenue to help pay the debt that funded the development of those projects. As businesses have had great disruption, whether they've been closed or restricted in the way they operate, it has certainly had an impact on their cash registers, and that's something we're going to need to be mindful of to see where those revenues are to pay debt service in the years ahead. So with that concludes my presentation, and I'm going to go ahead and unshare the screen. And Meg, I am going to defer to you for our question and answer session.
Thanks, Zach. So there is about a 5 to 10 second delay from what we are hearing on the call and what you guys see on the screen. So as we are waiting for those questions come in, Zach, can you give an overview of what the budget process is from here on out and what people can expect over the next few weeks?
Yeah, certainly. So, of course, at any time, our citizens have the right and should have the expectation to contact their elected officials, myself as city manager, provide that feedback, whether that be through email, probably the best manner right now through email, but they can also certainly call and let us know. This coming Monday night at the city council meeting, the city charter does require a public hearing on the budget that gives the public the opportunity to come in without time restrictions. It's not the typical requesting to speak to council. It is a full public hearing. You can come in and speak to the council, give your input on what you think of this proposed budget, items that you wish to see included, items that you wish to see not included, whatever that feedback may be. That is Monday night, the opportunity to do so. Monday, June 1st, our budget ordinance will be introduced at the city council meeting and given a first reading. And at the June 15th city council meeting, the city council will hear a second reading of that ordinance and have a final vote on that budget. And then the fiscal year will begin July 1st, 2020 and run through June 30th of 2021.
Very good. So one question that we have on our Facebook platform is related to park trail maintenance, and that is the Rock Creek Trail. Do we have any budget maintenance money planned to address some of the grading and issues associated with motorcycles and quad runners on the trail?
Okay, thanks, Meg. I want to let the public know that we're very fortunate to have many of our department directors attending tonight to help us answer all the questions we get. And we're, one of those directors here tonight is our Parks, Recreation, and Tourism Director, Eric Erfer. Eric, if you would give us a little bit of an overview of what our trail maintenance budget looks like for the season.
Yes, for that particular trail, we will continue to do the aggregate overlay in areas that are experiencing issues. We have done that for the past 2 years. There are some drainage issues along that, since it is along the Rock Creek Trail, and that is an ongoing maintenance issue. We'll be doing that overlay again this summer.
Thank you, Eric.
Right now we're running a little slow on questions. So Zach, is there any other pieces that you would like to cover in particular?
You know, I intended to say this at the beginning, Megan. This isn't a specific budget comment, but being that this is an opportunity to dialogue with the public, I want to thank our public for the responsiveness they have shown to this COVID-19 pandemic. They have stepped up in many ways, whether that be by donating masks to sites, our sermon center, filling those masks and bringing those, whether that be just the simple adherence to the stay-at-home order. We've gotten great compliance on that from our business community, from our residents. These are not easy tasks that we've asked for. There's been a lot of information to digest out there, and I want to thank our public. We've been able to keep those numbers low for our area, those confirmed cases, in part because of the strong response that we've seen from our community. I know that's required a tremendous amount of adaptation to a new normal, but on behalf of our city staff and our city council, I want to thank the public for the responsiveness they've shown to that.
One of the questions that was asked by the council on Monday night was related to CDBG funding, and we have CDBG funding that's been given to us to help with COVID response, and then we have regular CDBG funding. Do you want to give a little bit more information about those two sort of different uses that we have this year?
Yeah, we always get a share of what's known as Community Development Block Grant funding from the federal government. That is based on economic income factors for our community, as well as our population size. And that funding can be used for some restricted uses like public service things such as utility assistance, rent assistance, home repair, economic development, infrastructure maintenance, so on and so forth. This year, as part of one of the relief packages passed by the federal government, a supplemental amount of funds was adopted by Congress, and the city's allocation of that was $478,000. Council will vote on an ordinance Monday night to approve the allocation of CDBG funds not only for next year, but that $478,000. And generally speaking, our proposal is to allocate about $185,000 of that toward small business relief, small business microloan, about $70,000 or so of that towards the public assistance, about $90,000 of that towards our staff administrative time, and somewhere around $125,000 for public transit. So the council will hear the second reading of that ordinance and vote Monday night.
And we still are not having any other questions from the public. So one good question is, how can people sign up to participate in the public hearing on Monday, which will be another digital meeting?
Yes, certainly. Go to our website, contact the city clerk's office. Those are the various ways that, probably the most direct ways to contact the city clerk, Becky Behrens. Again, we're in this digital format because of the public health restrictions, but we will work with the public to get them that information to call in or video in to the meeting and be able to participate in that.
All right, well, we will be accepting questions on Facebook following this event. So there will be an opportunity for people to continue to ask those questions if they don't have them right now. There is the official budget public hearing on Monday and ongoing opportunities at council meetings leading up to the vote in June on the proposed budget. Anything else you'd like to close out with tonight, Zach?
Again, this budget has not been an easy one to work on, but I would like to thank our department directors and our city staff for the resiliency they've shown in coming forward with creative ideas. The city council has some important decisions ahead of them, and I know would certainly welcome that public input in helping them guide and make those final determinations. Thank you again for the opportunity to present, and look forward to continuing the conversation later on.
All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and sign off. Thank you for joining us for the Digital Budget Town Hall. We will see you on Monday night.